We're particularly interested in peatlands because it's an area we have very little knowledge right now, and it's an area where we think we have very high emissions of carbon to the atmosphere. These emissions are associated with removal of forest vegetation from the peatlands, of drainage of those peatlands to allow them to be converted into oil palm plantations, into pulpwood plantations. And these lands become more tree crop type of production systems. So they're fertilized. When you add nitrogen to these peats, you get a lot of carbon dioxide given off. You also get a lot of nitrous oxide, which is a very potent greenhouse gas compared to carbon dioxide. So a little bit of nitrous oxide is worth a lot of carbon as far as the atmosphere is concerned, as far as the balance of radiation or heat in the atmosphere is concerned. So we want to start putting some key numbers on these types of systems to help countries improve their ability to do their greenhouse gas accounting. If they can give accurate accounting of their greenhouse gases, they can begin to participate in these global mechanisms. And that's particularly important if we're talking about significant financial transfers from developed countries to developing countries, for these developing countries to alter their practices in the way they're managing their lands. So that's a key area for us in as far as facilitating these international mechanisms. But we always do this with respect to understanding what this can mean for local communities and local populations. If they can't measure and monitor the net greenhouse gas balance of the land management systems that they're putting in place, they can't participate in these international markets. They can't benefit from these international financial mechanisms. So we're trying to remove a technical barrier, and we're focusing on some of the highest priority areas where the least knowledge exists, but that have the greatest potential to impact these communities, so that they can begin to participate in these international markets, in these international mechanisms, and benefit financially from that. The other area that we're particularly focused on is trying to help countries set their what they call a reference level, reference emission level. Reference emission level is sort of a way of saying what's the baseline. What would happen if a country did not participate in the RED mechanism? They need to be able to project forward what their greenhouse gas emissions would have been if they hadn't undertaken more sustainable land management practices. And that's not always easy to do, because you're trying to prove the counterfactual. If they've undertaken activities, they no longer have those emissions to compare against. So we need to come up with some means of projecting. In some respects, these types of emissions levels are going to be political decisions. But they need to be informed political decisions. They need to be based upon reality. So we're trying to put together with partners in Norway and partners in several countries, put together a modeling framework that allows them to do some projections, sort of what-if types of scenarios. And those models take into account sort of the biology of the system, how much carbon is there, how is the carbon cycling, and then the economic drivers of land use change and land management. And we try and use those economic drivers to project land use forward in time, so that we can say, without participating in this international RED mechanism, the likelihood, if we assume this or this type of economic situation, for example, we assume the price of beef is this, we would have had this much deforestation for cattle pasture production. If the price of oil palm is this, we would have had this much deforestation and this much emission of CO2 to the atmosphere for oil palm plantations. So we're trying to incorporate our understanding of the economics with some spatial analysis of the carbon stocks to project forward what are likely emissions in the future, given what we know about economic drivers today. Okay, and that's really to help inform the political process of decision making around what's the emissions level that a country bases its crediting on. That's a very important point. If we're putting teams on the ground to do these measurements, we're not just going to measure diameter and heights of trees. We're going to be measuring some of these other types of services, and we're working now with a number of partners to develop indicators so that when a team goes out in the field and measures, does the carbon estimation, they're at the same time looking at biodiversity values, looking at perhaps watershed values in some situations where that's appropriate, looking at other types of values that these ecosystems can play, and the types of products that these ecosystems can play or provide to communities. So if communities are using forests as a key source of medicinal plants, we'll incorporate that into the surveys that we ask the communities to undertake in the field. And that's, I think, another important aspect of what we're doing. We're looking very seriously at community-based measurement and monitoring, that the communities do this themselves, that it's not a bunch of professional foresters or international experts to come in and do the carbon assessments, but that the communities actually participate with the experts in undertaking the activities, that they participate in data collection, they participate in the design of the data collection, so that they get information that's useful to them as well, so that they can begin to perceive the values and how the values that they consider important are changing with time. So it's not just about carbon, what we're doing. Carbon is perhaps the major impetus for the international financing in this. Our concern is how can we better define the roles and help communities understand the roles of forests and the value of forests to them. I've been working in climate change issues for the past 15, 16 years now, but I started my career in West Africa, in the Sahel, and I started it in the 1980s, right after the drought. So I had seen, how a significant climate event had a major negative impact on the communities. And I started as a volunteer, so I was actually living in the village and very close to people, and had a very good understanding of what it meant to individual people personally. So it sort of grew out of that to understand we often talk about the environment as sort of a luxury, but I think in smallholder subsistence types of systems, the environment is not some sort of luxury. It's not something separate from the way people earn their living. It's the basis for their living. So to understand how this major perturbation, this major experiment that we're undertaking as a human species, and altering the climate systems of the Earth, how that's going to have an impact on communities, and most of all, what can they do to improve their resilience to these types of perturbations, has really been the motivational factor for why I'm involved in this and why I really care about this issue.